Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's media manager here in Washington, D.C. The tension between the local authorities and informal leaders in the autonomous Gorno-Badakhshan region of Tajikistan has taken a new turn last week when the authorities began squeezing the local informal leaders and influencers. In the latest turn of events within the past few days, a prominent Badakhshani activist, Alo Watshoyev, was arrested in Russia and deported to Tajikistan, where he is apparently in detention. This case followed trouble with another Badakhshani activist, martial arts player Chorshanbe Chorshanboyev. Charges seem to be pending in the local court, and the biggest of all was the charges against Mohammed Bokirov, one of the influential figures in the region. So the accusations against them are something in the line of hyping ethnic division, insulting government officials, etc. But for locals, none of them make sense, and they question government's real intention, pointing at the activities of special forces, etc. in the region. So what is going on in Gorno-Badakhshan region? What is this all about? What is the backstory and what's next in this tension? To discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Susana Levy-Sanchez, author of the recent book called Bridging State and Civil Society, Informal Organizations in Tajik Afghan Badakhshan. Subhia Mastanshoyeva, independent researcher. Her background is on peace building, gender, and human rights, and Subhia is currently doing graduate studies in Geneva. Sirojuddin Tolibov, managing editor of Radio Free Radio Liberty's Tajik service. Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Radio Liberty's Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today on this very important conversation. So let me start with you, Sirojuddin. As we speak, what is happening in the region? Sort of kind of reality check on the ground. What's going on?
Yeah, everything started with the arrest, deportation of Chorshanbe Chorshanbeyev. It's a semi-professional MMA fighter. He was a well-known figure in Russia among Pamiris, and he was also outspoken critic of Tajik regime. He also used degradatory words towards, some other regions of the country. Eventually, he was arrested for traffic violation and then deported to Tajikistan. Upon the arrival, he was arrested, and this was the beginning of outcry in Pamir region. All was happening after the events in Kharukh. And then after that, Alauddinov was arrested. He was also a leader of Pamiri youth in Russia. He disappeared, and then later on, prosecutor's office of Tajikistan admitted that he was extradited to Tajikistan, but interim ministry said that he voluntarily returned to Tajikistan. So after that, the authorities announced that they put into the wanted list Mohammed Bokirov, who is one of the well-known figures in Badakhshan, who lives in Badakhshan. So although he claims that he had nothing to do, he never criticizes the authorities. So as we can see, many well-known activists of Badakhshan are being arrested. People are very concerned of uncertainty. Badakhshan is cut off from other parts of the world. More than 100 well-known figures of Badakhshan, including the former governor of Badakhshan, can't leave the country. So it seems that 45% of the country is completely isolated. There is no internet, and blackouts also happening.
Thank you, Sirojuddin, for you and your colleagues on Azadi for terrific reporting on that. They have been extremely helpful to understand this complex tension. Equally helpful was Subhia, your op-eds reflecting truly a local perspective in this tension. I know that you are not currently in Tajikistan, as your writings tell me that you are from there with existing local sources. So tell us, please, how your sources describe the situation as we speak on the ground.
The situation on the ground is becoming quite intense because people, apart from the whole idea of which I don't support and people on the ground don't support either, is that everything is linked to these informal leaders. People are quite concerned with the fact that the case of alleged extrajudicial killing of Gulbuddin Ziobekov back in November, and the investigation on the case and the investigation of the then use of force against demonstrators, which also led to the death of two other civilians deaths and injuries among the demonstrators are not really moving forward. And the commission that was established by the people themselves, it's quite representative. The commission is comprised of 44 people from the civil society, and they represent not just the administrative center Khorog, but they represent the different rayons. In this sense, they're quite representative. And they're not really in a position to work because a lot of tensions are happening. Lots of pressure is on the commission as well. So they can't really move forward with the investigation and with the work, both with people and with the local government, as they are supposed to be the dialogue makers. So this becomes quite worrisome for many, as we were putting lots of hope on the commission and thinking that they are legitimate, they have been established by law, so they have legitimacy, but now they're not really being listened to, and they can't really move forward with the investigation and with making sure that there's some dialogue and negotiations are going on.
So the investigation process now, is it stuck?
The investigation process is not clear. I mean, the investigation, first of all, was only started it was going on the case of Gulbuddin Ziobekov, the alleged extrajudicial killing. But the cases of deaths of people who were among the demonstrators, they have not been investigated. So this was one of the concerns that the commission was raising. But also with the death of Gulbuddin, it's not clear whether the investigation team is meeting or are they continuing the work. It's not really clear. And then the commission, apart from that, also does many other types of works. They are talking to the people. They are gathering other claims of people, for instance, being injured, and claims on the internet blockage and things like that. But a lot of pressure is on them now to practically stop to talk to the people and stop making any statements. They've just released a video statement a few hours ago, making a statement to the UN High Commissioner, as I would say they have lost hope in many other mechanisms of solving the issue locally.
Very worrisome. Just kind of a personal question there to you, Subia. So when was the last time you had the chance to speak to your family there, or maybe your friends and contacts on the ground?
I talked to my family 1.5 weeks ago. It's not possible to contact them through social media as we used to do before. You can call through Skype. It's quite expensive for people to call through Skype and to talk to their people on the ground. But it was 1.5 weeks ago. But we do have contacts with the commission members. So, for instance, in doing human rights reporting and things like that, you can call them. It's not also possible to do regularly, but you can do that from time to time.
Speaking of the commission, I guess you were talking about the problems, the way it's working, or the obstacles. I guess the government has already made its mind as they are chasing these local leaders, even without waiting for the outcome of those reports. That's also a concerning element. But yes, Sirajuddin, maybe I could invite you back here. Maybe Bruce, you could jump in here. So we are talking about here, at least when speaking to this latest round of tensions, 3 names sort of emerge in the headlines: Chorshambayev, the martial art player, Alowat Shoyev, the activist who was brought back from Russia, Mehmet Bokirov, who are in the hot water. So please educate us if there are other names that I'm missing in this mix.
As far as we know, more than 100 people in the blacklist. They can't leave the country at all. They can't live abroad. And plus, apart from that, there is a huge campaign which makes local people are very unhappy.
Sirajuddin, when you say huge campaign, how should we visualize that? What is happening?
Regional TV are forcing local authorities, ethnic Pamiris, to talk on TV and criticize those who died during that events in Khorog. And plus,
you are talking about the number.
Although investigation is going on, and then apart from that, there are huge campaign to stop the criticizing authorities. Even our colleagues in Dushanbe have been called several times to the foreign ministry and they requested us to stop reporting about events in Pamir until investigation is completed. But we denied, and we possibly may face charges from the authorities in the future, in nearest future. This is what they said recently.
Susanna, maybe you want to jump in here. So Sirajuddin is talking about, in addition to these three names that I mentioned, and there are people in the wanted list, what is the kind of connecting point between these people who are currently being sought after by the authorities?
Sirajuddin, I hope you and your colleagues are okay there. Just briefly, before I go into the connecting points, I'm just going to mention a couple other people that, from what I understand. So Araz Vazirbekov is a Pamiri leader in Moscow. He put out a video, I think yesterday, saying that the Tajik government is coming to assassinate him, and saying that he is a Russian citizen. And he is a strong leader like Abbat Shoya Amridin there, but he's more on the intellectual side of the leadership. That's one. And then there's also Jamshedov, who is sort of Bokhir's deputy. From what I understand, they're going after him as well as a group of leaders that are around Bokhir. There are these hundreds on the blacklist. There always seems to be these huge lists after protests, but there are specific people that the government really wants to get rid of or control their voice. And so how it connects, in my opinion, is that all of these leaders are influential, and they have influence both within the Pamiri diaspora as well as the Pamiris living in Khorog. And they also have voice within the international community in Russia and toward the UN. But they are all vulnerable because they are in Russia and in the Pamirs. There is one other person that has been arrested, which is the mother of Abdurrahman Zuranai, I think is how you pronounce his name. He is a popular blogger from Vadat, who is in Germany, but he spoke in support of the Pamiris. And his mother was arrested 5 days ago. So it seems to me they've been trying to crack down on these informal leaders, local leaders, for a very long time. And now they are doing more so. I mean, I have some rumors or notes about troops that have been moved there and the various articles against Bokhir that Asia Plus published in the Tajik Penal Code. And it all seems to be pointing toward getting rid of any influence or any independence of the Pamiris in the region in order to be in control of that region. I guess the question is why, right?
Yeah.
Why do they want to be in control? And should I speculate on that?
I mean, we are going to speculate about that, Suzy, in any way. I mean, the region is already part of Tajikistan. As what else you want to control there and why you want to do that. There are so many questions, and we are going to talk about these aspects when we discuss this case in the background. So before that, Bruce, first of all, I guess I have two questions to you. One is, what do you see happening there? And the second thing is the official line as to what these people have done wrong. I mean, the ones who are currently in trouble are detained, and the ones who are being sought after. When you study the official line, what does that tell you?
Well, it's kind of interesting just that it's happening now. I suppose it was always inevitable. The government has always had at best a tenuous hold over this region, right? And in the past, their hold was based on agreements that they made with these people that were calling informal leaders, right? So there was kind of a truce that has fallen apart several times over the last 15, 20 years, without a doubt. But there's like these agreements that they reached. The thing that I find disturbing about this is that the government seems to really be pushing this and feel that there's some reason why they can actually go after these people that we're calling informal leaders at this particular moment. There's different reasons I suppose we could get into, and I'd be happy to talk about it too in a minute. But so they're charging them all with, like you said, I mean, there's all range, inciting national hatred, a bunch of things, and the Tajik government's been happy, and certainly some officials have been happy to keep calling these people criminals, right? They brand them variously as being in charge of whatever narcotics, some smuggling routes, maybe narcotics. Sometimes it's cigarettes, sometimes it's semi-precious stones and things like that. But they never charged them with anything that had to do with that. So they've been really tarnishing their image, and really that's one of the big things that these local leaders are unhappy about. Mahmoud Bakhirov is one that says that they're putting people on TV that are making all kinds of claims about him that just aren't true, or at least one person, the local head head of education, who then said that, not only called him terrorist essentially, but said that Mahmoud Baghirov beat him up. The energy minister, I think, also singled out Mahmoud Baghirov and said that he was also a criminal, things like that. So, but they're really pushing it hard this time, and it's across a wide group of these local leaders. I mean, there's been some individuals they've been unhappy with in the past, and they've gone after them unsuccessfully, and it's always caused problems. But they seem to have lined them all up, and they're going after all of them at once. It split the community too. Sirojudin was saying they're getting locals to trying to force them to come on TV and say that these people really are criminals and stuff. And then there's other members of the community up there who are out making these people that appear on TV outcasts. I mean, it's really split the whole community up. And the backdrop to all this is the introduction of forces, government forces up there who have clearly been trying to get Mahmoud Baghirov and probably some other ones too, but they tried to get around his house. And it's only because his supporters have prevented them that they probably haven't taken him into custody already, although that one would imagine that violence would break out immediately. But there's a lot of things that are happening up there. One thing I'll mention too, because I want to let everybody else talk, is that this all started after Yadgar Faizov left the post. He was the head of Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast region, and
he was the governor or what?
He was replaced at the start of November, and all the problems started after they brought in the new guy, Alishir Mirzanabad.
That's very interesting too. I mean, I don't know who might want to jump in here. Like when I was, reading, for example, also these reports, and especially the way Mehmet Baghirov is responding to this. I mean, he's clearly pointing finger at governor. So at least speaking of this tension surrounding Mehmet Baghirov, is it of this governor's creation, or how much of involvement is there by Dushanbe in what's happening in the region as we speak?
So when we talk about Muhammad Baqir, we must admit that he's a very controversial figure. Although he is well known in Badakhshan, we know that he went to a local authorities' home and demanded him to leave his place, to leave the area immediately, because he made a statement on TV. And when we interviewed him, Muhammad Baqir was very rude, openly, and that.
What you said?
Although
what you mean when you say rude?
Said that he had nothing to do with, say he did not come out against the authorities. He never was against the government's policy. Now he's in the wanted list now. As far as we understand, the new governor is pressuring on people. Yeah, we can feel that. On the other hand, the Dushanbe authorities are also very concerned of the situation in the region. As you know, such events as it happened a few months ago happens every 2-3 years in Badakhshan. The worst of which was in 2012. When more than 100 people were killed. So we have to bear in our mind that the feeling in that region is completely different than other parts of the country. And unemployment is very high, and the population is only 230,000, and almost 45% of the country is in Badakhshan's territory. So authorities are very concerned, and they started, tightening the grip after the events in Kazakhstan, especially. I think there is a sense of concern among the Tajik authorities as well.
Yeah, as you were talking about, Sirojudin, such events kind of repeats once in 2-3 years, but this time it looks like in a whole different level, like, all the way. Russia seems to be in cohort in some ways, like, detaining those influential Pamiris, Badakhshanis, and deporting them to Tajikistan. So that kind of, brings us to this question earlier Suzy was talking about. What is really government is trying to do here, and what is the background story in all this in the context of where things might be headed going forward. So let's continue the debate talking about these aspects very shortly. First, let me recap the conversation that today on the Majlis podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Susana Levy-Sanchez, author of the recent book called Bridging State and Civil Society, Informal Organizations in Tajik Afghan Gorno-Badakhshan, Subhia Mastanshoiba, independent researcher on peace building in gender and human rights, and originally from Badakhshan, Sirojuddin Tolibov, managing editor of Radio Free Liberties Tajik service, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. I'm Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis podcast and Radio Free Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the brewing tension in Tajikistan's autonomous Gorno-Badakhshan region. So, in terms of the size and scale of this crackdown, maybe, Suzy, you would like to take this question. I mean, as Sirojuddin was talking about earlier, we had this tension back in November, and a couple of years back again, something triggers and we are again back into this kind of environment. But this time, maybe I'm exaggerating this, I don't know, but, people being brought back from Russia, what do you see? What really the Tajik authorities are trying to do here?
So in terms of the larger picture, I think it's important to look back at 2012, 14, 18, just a little bit. In my opinion, the 12 and 14, both I was pretty close to the area at both of those times. 2014, I was there to witness the entire thing. 2012, I was there right before that. And I think those were more about the illicit economy and then gaining control from the local leaders of those things in very aggressive ways. I actually think that this one is a little bit different. And while it might be about also controlling the economy, I think part of it has to do, and this might be a little controversial, is, I think China and Russia both have authoritarian dictatorships. The Taliban took over on the other side of the border. The West has withdrawn. And the Tajik government now has an opportunity with the support of Russia and China to really assert a certain amount of authority. There recently has been Russian sort of propaganda outlet saying that the Aga Khan Development Network and the Aga Khan Foundation which has been going on this propaganda for a while, are instruments of the West. So there's kind of a movement and a fear of the locals are fearing, from what I have heard, as well as it appears this propaganda is trying to delegitimize the Aga Khan Foundation and AKDN, which they view as the Western sort of bulwark in the area that is countering the Chinese and Russian and Tajik authoritarian crackdown. But it does seem that as, China is allegedly funding this base in Ishkashim, and Russian troops allegedly are in what was former Shurabad. I forget the new name of the area. There's allegedly Belarusian Spetsnaz that are now in Selkov Technica at the military base there. There's a lot more of those countries' involvement to really gain control of both the region in the security sphere as well as the economic sphere. And I think there's also fear among locals that there's a purge Pamiri identity in a way, and the independence that is being supported in Moscow by the expat community. So they feel they need to crack down on the outside expat community as much as the inside in order to control the influencers, if that makes sense. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, there are a couple of points that I would like to follow. But before that, on the question of timing, Sophia, you already raised your hand, which is great, which also gives me an idea that you want to say something about what you just heard from Dr. Susanna. Please do that. But my second question to you was, Sophia, in terms of the timing, what is the local perspective on the timing, and what do they think? Why all this is happening right now? What comes to your mind as a local there?
Thank you, Muhammad. I think I agree with Susan in the sense that when she mentions that this time it's quite different, and apart from the geopolitical reasons and factors that she mentioned, I think from the perspective of the persistence impunity that is happening in Gabao is another thing to consider, because the local people have seen these violations coming from the law enforcement and security forces for many years now. It's a decade now. So it's happened in 2012, it's happened in 2014, not only in Horog, but also in Ishkashim, for instance. It happened in Rushan. So there have been several incidents of breach of law by the security forces and the law enforcement. And I think that it really came to the the point when the locals have really lost trust in and hope, in the sense that they don't see any kind of punishment following, and any due process, and any judicial process or anything. Justice is not really there. So that adds a lot to that. And the demonstrations that happened in November, they were quite different from what was happening back in time, because they were lots of the protesters were women. I was told that more than half of them were women, and it doesn't really link with that theory of criminal groups mobilizing young people to come and protest. So there were lots of women. And you can see from the videos that are put on social media that statements also during the demonstrations were made by women mostly. And then there were lots of also demonstrations outside of Tajikistan as well. We've seen that in Moscow and in other cities. So I think this time it's lots of other people who didn't really have any sentiments for informal leaders before. They didn't know even them. Some of the young people don't know them. They haven't met them, for instance. I have never met any of the informal leaders myself. Now the issue is more around, we've seen these things happening, but we've never seen any follow-up on this, and no investigation. Nothing is really happening. So the size of the people that are protesting now, and the category of people that are protesting, is quite different from what we have seen back in the other incidents. And I think that also plays a big role in why the government is being quite serious with the response as well, because it's becoming a really socially legitimized protest by not just people in Gabao, but also throughout Tajikistan as well.
That's very interesting point there, Subia. Thank you very much. Bruce, if I can invite you here, these tensions we are talking about today, and there were another episode in November last year, and as Subia was talking about, is a decade-old story. Tensions come and goes, but there has to be a backstory, a bigger story triggering all this in the background. What is that?
The immediate tension is, as Sabia said, a young man was killed there in November. And a lot of people there think that justice hasn't been done. They portrayed him as being the villain in all this when, security forces came to his house, shot him, and now they're trying to make it sound like there was a big shootout or something. It's real unclear if that was exactly what happened or not. But the government seems to just be going with the security services line that, he resisted arrest and so he was shot, and that's it. And a lot of people are real unhappy about that because they see it more as an assassination where the security force went and got him and killed him.
When an incident like this happens, and those existing tensions comes together, and suddenly you have a big protests going on, and then in response, Tajik authorities come and they crack down. And what I'm saying is, I'm just kind of trying to understand what is the backstory, why there is tension in the first place in Gabao.
Well, okay. The simple answer is it's a unique region, as we've heard. This is not, the people there are not ethnic Tajiks. The indigenous people there are not ethnic Tajiks. They're different. And yet they have to obey the rules of the Tajik government and have to be educated in Tajik language and all that. So there's obviously a tension there. They want autonomy. And in fact, the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast, at least in Russian, is how that reads. But they don't really have this kind of autonomy, right, at all. The government is trying to impose some kind of control over them. And I can give you a simple example of how this works. And I've heard that people up there have complained about this before. Now, because they're an autonomous oblast, they're supposed to have certain rights, some special rights that the rest of the country doesn't enjoy. Now, one of those is they're supposed to be able to put a tax on goods coming into Tajikistan from China, all right, that are coming on the road. But a lot of the stuff that's coming from China is going to companies that are owned by members of Rahman's family, President Rahman's family, or his friends, and they're freed from taxes. So all that stuff goes through, and the money that should stay in Gorno-Badakhshan and help the local economy doesn't ever appear. Because these people are exempted from having to pay taxes when they go through. So this is something that the locals are like, well, what? Why we get none of that money then? Even though we were supposed to get some of it, and we're the poorest region in Tajikistan, and yet still we can't get this. So it's those kind of problems. There's promises of things that they're supposed to get that are special rights that don't come through. A lot of people see the government and the people in the lowlands of Tajikistan, for lack of a better term, as not really being part of their people. They're religiously, most of them are different than the rest of Tajikistan. They're Ismaili Shiites as opposed to Sunni. So there's some significant differences between them, and they want to preserve that. And they want to preserve their old cultures too, their traditions up there. But they're being pressured to conform It's kind of a much smaller version of what was happening with China and Xinjiang. It's hard to compare that exactly, but it's still similar, where this is a unique culture that feels that it's being culturally exterminated by the government in Dushanbe.
Yeah, I know Dr. Susanna has a lot to say about this, but also local perspective is important to understand the real scope of the problem. So, Subia, just to loop you back here, this, as you said, the tension comes and goes, and every time trigger might be something different, but in the background there is this long-lasting grievances, long-lasting distrust. So what they think that the Tajik authorities are doing wrong there from their perspective?
Yes, sure. I think but from the local perspective is that, first of all, that's the poorest region. So there's this feeling of neglect, I guess, from the central government. There's a really high level of unemployment in the region. There's a really high level of youth who are neither enrolled in school nor in employment, the so-called NEET category of youth, who are quite vulnerable to becoming engaged in crime and all types of things. So we have the highest number of male NEET in the country. And there are so many other vulnerability categories where Gabao comes as first. So I think these are some of the socioeconomic factors that play out, and people do feel that these grievances are not really met. And then apart from that, people feel that the region is being highly militarized. So there's, every year the militarization continues, and that also gives the impression that the government is not trusting the people either. The government is not trusting the local government. In Gabao, the government is not trusting local people who are working within the law enforcement, and that's why they are sending these troops from Dushanbe and other places. So this also becomes like an issue, that why this distrust towards us. Is there something else, behind that? So I think, and this has built up for years now, and it's going to be quite difficult to really try to bridge these divisions and this distrust. But I think, the Commission can play quite a big role if the government is willing to focus on the Commission and to focus on a dialogue rather than using, force again, as it's been in the past.
Yeah. So you say, Subia, that the Commission could have been utilized better and be used as an opportunity to lay the foundation of something that they could build on. It's pity, but again, that sort of explains the nature of this deep-seated mistrust between the local informal leaders and the authorities in Tajikistan. Dr. Susanna, I guess both Bruce and Subia kind of hinted to this, but given your in-depth research on this particular matter, I also wanted to hear your thoughts on this, maybe from a little different perspective. As we all discussed, it is a decade-old tension. Cases after cases sort of added new layer into this tension. I know it's not going to be easy to sort it out, but I just wondered your thoughts on what are some of the specific areas where thinking among the local leaders and the authorities drastically differ from each other in terms of sources of the problem and the possible areas of solution. I'm just trying to point at the gap between these two parties and whether that can be bridged in some ways.
I think, first of all, the grievances between the different, for lack of a better word, ethnic or ethno-linguistic groups and ethno-religious groups, those were formed and cultivated at the beginning of the Soviet period. And not only between the Tajiks and the Pamiris, but even the Shugnis and the Roshanis and the Roshkali, as the purging of local leaders and then access to the Supreme Soviet, so to speak. That's one thing, and those tensions have continued into today in various ways. And then I think what Bruce said about this, the taxes don't make it to the local areas. In the battle in 2014, where they shot three local leaders, and two of them died. From what I understood, I interviewed them both at length. They were in charge of the tax, so to speak, that goes in and out of the city. And at that point, the Tajik government wanted to take that back. So there's that issue. I think the other issue is that what I think Subia said is that this is not only, or maybe Bruce said it, this is not only anymore an issue of just the Pamiris. other Tajiks are getting involved, as well as other people in the larger Tajik diaspora, aside from the Pamiris. And that, I agree with Sabia completely, that really hasn't happened to that extent before. And I think that, the informal leaders have a position of local governance. And I've interviewed most of them and asked what their role is. And their role really is to actually find ways to support the community, not enrich themselves, and be conduits with the government. I think that this commission was similar to a group that formed in 2014, but this one is more formalized. And I think there was a lot of hope around the commission. I think the Tajik government actually issued an arrest warrant for Farmuz, the lawyer, if I'm not mistaken. And that's also a new, much more aggressive form of going after people or the local civil society leaders that are trying to bridge the gap between the locals and the government, because many of the locals feel the government is actually not fulfilling their function as a government in that area. Again, going back to the taxes don't make it there, the president's family takes over businesses, controls, for example, the bazaars and various other businesses, and it's very difficult for families and youth to be able to gain access to that local economy. So what Bruce said is, and I'll wrap up, I'm sorry I'm going on, but the killing of Gulbuddin ignited this brush that was ready to go, because it was one more thing against the local community that seemed extremely, out of place for the government. They went after and killed a local citizen, and, it's not the role of the government to kill local citizens. It's the role to arrest and try in court, et cetera, et cetera. Right. I don't know if that explains. I mean, it's challenging.
It is challenging. Now, obviously, we are not going to be able to, unpack everything that is attached to this tension with the history of it in one podcast. And perhaps this is the time we have to really wrap up the conversation today. But maybe very last point here, the way I look into this, and as I think I repeated this a couple of times already during this conversation, I mean, the size and scope, the frequency, the coordination of this tension on all sides, like both from the authorities' perspective, like bringing back those people, activists from abroad, from Russia, and maybe the ones who could not be brought, kind of squeezing their family members in Tajikistan, and the way they are kind of, issuing these warrants, or maybe blacklisting people from leaving the country, or maybe isolating this region. And on the other hand, Gorno-Badakhshan, people are rising up more often, more frequent, and they are speaking up elsewhere outside and inside Tajikistan. So this thing it's not going anywhere, but it's brewing up. So where is this going? Where is this going next after this stage? I mean, I guess this is the last question I wanted to ask, and we can start with any of you. Maybe Sirajuddin, as a journalist, where do you see this thing is going from here?
Muhammad, it's very difficult to predict because, we don't know what's going to happen next. The feeling of being different from other parts of the country among the Pamiri youth, especially those who live in Russia, is rising. Russia's policy also is contributing to that feelings as well. You have to remember that in Badakhshan, there are many distinct languages, Shughni, Rushani, Khufi, Bartangi, Rushani, Sarikuli, Yazgulami, and some of them are, endangered. They are included into the Red Book. So when they speak, they communicate in Tajik between each other. You have to remember that it is a very sensitive issue, although, the population is religiously is also different from other parts of the country. But many people in other parts of the country are also very sympathetic to these people. And we have to remember that the other people, intelligentsia, let's say so, among Tajiks are very concerned of these, separatistic feelings. They don't want these, rise and to cause problems. For them, it's national unity, integrity, oneness of Tajikistan is very important. And I think, some leaders in Badakhshan also understand this. And it may change rapidly. It depends on big players of the region as well, of course.
Right. Okay. Same question, in fact. What are the areas, perhaps, let me put it that way, Subhia, you will keep your eyes on, which are indicative of where things are headed from here after this stage?
I think the first thing is how the whole investigation will go on and what
commission.
will be eventually the result of it, and whether something will follow and it will be objective investigation. So that would play a big role. And I agree with Sirujadeen in the sense that we have been, I mean, civil society and people outside of the country and those who are engaged in human rights work, we've been trying really hard to push back these sentiments of separatism and these feelings of like being neglected and being discriminated against, and these feelings among youth a lot. But I can feel that it's getting really hard and hard to explain to people, to explain to a group of young people that this is not the way to deal with this. And if things will get escalated and the use of force will be the option for dealing with the situation, I think it's going to be quite unpredictable, and I fear that these separatist sentiments will really raise.
In the meantime, again, the question is the same, but just to add one more additional thought here that might kind of play some role going forward in terms of the way authorities are going to deal with the situation going forward is, Rahman is not a young man. Imam Ali Rahman that I'm talking about is not a young man. I don't know when that will happen, but soon we will see some kind of change on the top of the leadership. But I don't know whether that is going to have any kind of implication in the way the Tajik authorities have been trying to deal with this situation. So the final question being, Dr. Susanna, to you, where do you see this thing is going after this stage?
I think to your question, I think what you asked before about gaps between the government and the locals is actually the path to where things will go. If the government continues to harass and if they continue to try to arrest Bokir, as we've seen, and as Sabia pointed out, there are more people involved in this, and there's also many more women who actually all went to Barkharok to protect Bokir. So that went on, and there also were troops that were trying to get into Gulakin, the center of Khorok, 2 days ago, I think, and the youth stopped them at the Jamaat Khana, which is down outside of the main part of the city. So it is very clear that either the feelings of separatism or the feelings of we're an autonomous region, and this is, if you're not going to give us an economy, you're going to attack our people, we're going to protect our space. I think that will happen if the government continues their troop movement. They've, enlisted popular front fighters from Kulab. They have these outside fighters. And I think that's the locals are feeling understandably squeezed and scared, as well as their local leaders are being threatened with arrest, and there's this blacklist. So if that continues, the locals, they are, from what I understand, there are night watches. There's, coordinated trainings among locals, and they want to be able to negotiate with the government through these civil society leaders to come to a fair agreement, and that isn't happening.
Yeah, the commission that earlier Sophia was referring to seems to be one path to go to that direction. And also the other thing that you hinted, Sophia, is like at the moment, and I was reading on Azodi's website, obviously Gorner is asking Mehmet Bakirov to surrender, and he says he's not going to surrender. He didn't do anything wrong. And then he was also saying that if they come, we will try to defend ourselves by stones. We don't have gun. So it looks like that, the tension around the question of his arrest might also be something to keep our eyes on. So, Bruce, where your eyes are and will be?
Is the government going to investigate some of these things properly? The death of Zia Bekov is one. And are they actually going to treat this region fairly and show some genuine interest in developing it? Like Susanna was saying earlier, that the Aga Khan, he's kind of a strange figure for the government. Sometimes he's vilified, sometimes he's praised, but without his help, the region would not be anywhere near where it is today. It's not well off, but it would be even worse off without the Aga Khan. So they should be encouraging more development. The government has to demonstrate that there's real justice being done to this region. I don't want to go backward in the story, but remember when they had the protests in November, there was 6 guys cut down some trees to block forces from coming into the city. I think 5 of them got sentenced to jail. some of them for like 4 years for cutting down trees to block the road or something like that. This just plays into that sense of they're picking on us all the time. The government has to do something to show them that there's some kind of fair process that they can use to express, to get justice for their complaints, and see that justice is done in cases where there's been abuses against them. And that really has never happened there. So
yeah, it has been a really, really interesting conversation, in-depth conversation. We often do not have the opportunity to talk about Gabon. I guess this is the first time we are doing this on the Majlis podcast. But, thank you very much for all of you. It's been really eye-opening conversation, at least speaking from my perspective. So thank you very much, Dr. Susana Levy-Sanchez, author of the recent book called Bridging State and Civil Society Informal Organizations in Tajik-Afghan Border. So if you have not yet gotten this book, please go to Amazon and get it. I am waiting for mine. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Sanchez, today. And also big thanks to Subhia Mastonshoiba, independent researcher on peace building, gender in human rights, and originally from Gorno-Badakhshan. Sirajuddin Tolibov, managing editor of Radio Free Liberties Tajik service, locally known as Radio Ozodi, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog Kishlok Owazi. So thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us today. And this is from me, Mohammed Tahir, host of the Majlis Radio Free Liberties current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. Until next week, bye-bye.